Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Holland. I'm a businessman. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a CPA that's worked in the corporate world, and I've worked in the investment and financial services industry. I've started multiple companies that have achieved millions of dollars in sales, and I've sold companies with multi-million dollar valuations. You can find more about my background on our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Follow me on Twitter, A Holland Podcast, to join us in the conversations that we have throughout the week outside of the podcast. Lastly, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, so you can get weekly updates when we post the video version every Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us each and every week to talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. It was 2009, and we had just gone through the great financial crisis. I had graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire with a major in accounting and business economics and a minor in finance and Spanish, or I was one off from a minor in either finance or Spanish, I don't remember. But I had been blessed to have received a job offer the previous summer to work for Ernst & Young as a CPA. And a lot of my colleagues who had received job offers during the summer of 2009, right before things really got hairy in the economy, had lost their job offers. So I was just so thankful to have one right out of college. What that entailed is me moving from Eau Claire, Wisconsin to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I would start my career in the corporate world as a public auditor, CPA with Ernst & Young. Now, I knew I was a very entrepreneurial motivated at that point, and so I was always looking to do a deal or start getting my feet wet when it came to trying things and being your own boss, so to speak, or taking some risks. Fast forward 6 months later, I've basically purchased a house in the city of Minneapolis, pretty much a redo house. And I'll go more into detail on that story a little bit later. I get a call from my brother who's helping me fix up this house. And he says, Andrew, this house doesn't have a foundation. And I said, What? What do you mean it doesn't have a foundation? Well, when I looked beneath the outer block, what appeared to make it look like it had a foundation, there was nothing. And that began a saga, almost 1.5 to 2 years in the making, of my first big catastrophic, for me, especially at the time, financially speaking, especially, failure. We'll return to that story in just a bit. Overcoming fear of failure is one of the number one reasons that people, both personally and professionally, don't take risks. Don't go out on their own and try something new. Try to be an entrepreneur. Try to start their own business. It can be anything. Try to accomplish a particular goal, run a marathon. It's because we are afraid of failure. This episode is going to be all about overcoming fear and facing your failures. And throughout this episode, I'm going to share with you some of my biggest failures, more distant. I've got lots of failures even today, but sometimes you need time for failures to settle and for you to fully absorb the learning opportunities from those failures. So I'll go back a number of years and focus on some major failures that I made it through, but that were very, very challenging. And the point in sharing these, and it's not fun to tell people that you failed and to share some of your biggest failures, but without sharing your failures and without other entrepreneurs sharing their failures, How can we learn? And so I'm always thankful to all the guests in the past who have shared their failures. And that's the reason that we're going to talk about some of my major failures today, is because when you acknowledge your failures, number one, they don't seem so scary. Number two, we can learn from them. For me, of course, I can certainly learn from them. And I hope that you won't have to go through those same things, because you can learn from my experiences, which is what life is all about, all of us learning from each other to hopefully prevent failures that other people have already achieved, or achieved is an interesting word. So things are smoother for you, but you're not going to be successful. And there's a million quotes to this specific point. You're not going to be successful without loads and loads of failures. Michael Jordan got cut from his high school basketball team. Think about that. Arguably one of the best basketball players of all time got cut from his high school basketball team. I would argue, had that not happened, had he not had that failure, he would never be a household name. That pushed him, and he's talked about this many times, and really changed something in him to be the best he can be. And we see how that resulted. But it all started with failure. And every success starts with failure, or is built on top of the back of failure. But failure is an actual thing that occurs. And that's not really what's so devastating and what prevents many people from doing it. It's the fear of failure. And so I want to focus first, before we talk about failures and what we can learn from them, is let's just talk about fear. Fear is a natural human emotion. That's obvious. That goes without saying, right? We all have fear. But what we often fail to either recognize or acknowledge, and I am just as guilty of this as anybody, and I'll talk about times, and one time particularly is in my mind of fear. And when I finally faced it, or was comfortable with it, how much more successful and efficient and more clearly I could think I was. So, but fear, whether we want to acknowledge it or whether we recognize it, is probably one of the most motivating forces in almost anything we do. Relationships, fear of being rejected, fear of something not working out, sales, cold calling, fear of being rejected, fear of someone telling us no, starting a business, fear of failure. And why is the fear of failure so incredibly powerful? Well, of course, none of us like failing, but I think, and my experience tells me, from my ability to view other people's experiences and my own experiences, is the primary fear of failure, of course, can mean financial disaster. It can mean changing your life status, economically speaking, which is related to financial disaster if you fail. But I think the biggest part of failure that makes us all afraid is what other people think. I want you to think about that. And everything I'm saying isn't revolutionary. Many, many people have talked about fear. But stop and think about your own life. Are you not doing things? And let's stick to the professional side of things, because you are afraid of what others will think if you fail. I know that that happened to me in my business. I know that it happens to me on a daily basis. We're always thinking about, well, what does that person think? Or if I do this and it doesn't work out, how is that going to look? And there are certain circumstances where that's good and that's appropriate, where you want to have some level of fear about what society will think or others will think. That's part of having the law, if you will. I should be afraid of the consequences of harming someone else or murdering someone else. Now, that's going to one extreme, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the world of right and wrong. We're talking about perception and what other people think. And I believe that the number one issue or inhibitor of each of our success is our inability to let go of what other people will think if we fail. And I want you, as you're listening to this, to take a step back and analyze your life and ask, is that true for me? Are are there things in my life that I am afraid to try because if I fail, what will my spouse, sons, daughters, grandparents, friends, colleagues think of me? Why do we let that have so much sway over us? It's quite scary. And that fear is what we should be actually afraid of. We'll return to that concept of letting other people's expectations, which is another part of that fear, a bit. We'll return to that concept a bit later. What I have found and what's funny about fear is it's driven by perceived consequences more often than actual consequences. And we've all had this experience where, let's keep it in the professional world, we have a speech to give. And if you're deathly afraid of public speaking, and I think most people are until you do it frequently, and then you realize, okay, this isn't actually that bad. And that's the key piece. The reality of the consequences in that scenario are far less damaging if you make a mistake or something of that nature. We all do, than what we dream up in our heads. And so when you have to give, again, let's use this as an example, a major speech in 2 weeks, and this has happened to me. I've been on public stages many times. The more I do it, it's much easier now because I've done it many, many, many times. But that doesn't mean it was easy at first. And I would think about that speech and I would worry about it. And I drove up all this angst and all this fear in my mind about, well, what if this or what if that? And then you do it. And all of that was wasted, fearful energy because things on balance went great. Did I make mistakes? Sure, multiple times. And that's fine because people in the audience recognize we're all human and we all make mistakes. Now, if you go into a major speech without any planning or preparation, then you should be afraid because that means you didn't take it seriously enough to at least put enough thought to make it valuable to the audience that you were talking to. One of the biggest things for me, going back to what I alluded to earlier, a specific time in my mind where fear really drove me, and until I let it go, I wasn't able to be as efficient and productive as I could be, was probably around year 2 in the garbage business that I've often talked about that my business partner Jeff and I had, Provider Waste Services. I believe that fear drove me those first 2 years. Enthusiasm, certainly. Young naivete, absolutely. The motivation that you have when you want to accomplish something and you're just getting out into the real world, all of that was there, and those are positive things. But I think what clouded my judgment is something that I hadn't faced or I hadn't acknowledged until I was forced to do so. And I think I've talked about this in one of my earlier episodes or one of my earlier podcasts. And it was, like I said, year 2 in the business, and things were not going well from a financial perspective. It's a very capital intensive to be operating in the waste services industry. As I've said in the past, I didn't come from money, Jeff didn't come from money. And so we were just trying to survive. And we had payroll the next day. And I had no clue how we were going to pay our employees. And it had been a really, really long day. I got home probably around 11:30, and I remember just sitting in my bed, falling down essentially, and sobbing because it had all culminated to a point of overexhaustion. I had moved on from Ernst& Young, moved back to Eau Claire to start the business. I was working in the financial services industry, starting my career as an analyst at M&I at that time, now BMO Harris Bank, or BMO, I think they just go by now. And there was so much on my plate. And in spite of being young, we all have a breaking point. And I essentially reached my breaking point there. And oftentimes, financial crises get us there. And looking back, I'm so thankful that I was forced into that position because it made me face my biggest fear, and that was fear of bankruptcy. And I think we're all deathly afraid of failure, and bankruptcy in business is considered one of the ultimate failures. And I'm not saying bankruptcy is good and that we should hope for bankruptcy. But what I realized that evening, because I got to that breaking point, is what happened if I actually claimed bankruptcy? What if the business failed and we did have to claim bankruptcy? And of course, if the business claimed bankruptcy, Jeff and I had personally guaranteed every loan that we had, so we personally would have to file bankruptcy. What's the worst that could happen? And this was one of those scenarios where when I actually thought about it, I actually thought about the true consequences versus the perceived, over dramatized consequences of that fear were really minuscule, especially for a 24-year-old. I didn't have a family at that time. I didn't have a tremendous amount of responsibility. Personally speaking, I had a tremendous responsibility from a business perspective because, of course, we had employees, we had customers, and that was, of course, terrifying. But if I claimed bankruptcy, if we had to claim bankruptcy, they couldn't take away my friends. They couldn't take away my family. I was living very modestly. I was renting out an apartment at that time because I didn't have any money. And really, other than having to say that I declared bankruptcy and I failed, that would be it. Now, I don't remember the extent of loans that we had at that time. And certainly, you never want to claim bankruptcy if you don't have to. And it would never be my intention, and hopefully, it's nobody's intention to claim bankruptcy. But it does happen, and financial institutions get harmed because if you have loans, they end up don't getting paid back. But there are ways to rectify that. Famous Dave's. We've probably all heard of Famous Dave's. If you haven't, it's a really famous, basically barbecue restaurant that has done really well with ribs and all things smoked and barbecue sauces of every flavor, shape, taste, size. He claimed bankruptcy. And a lot of his vendors, whether they were financial institutions due to loans or suppliers, lost money and got hurt. And what did he do? He didn't cry in his corner and woe to himself. I'm sure he had to digest it, but he took note of everybody that he had claimed bankruptcy on, the amount of money he owed to them. And when he became majorly successful, he paid them all back. And if my memory serves correctly, and then some. Now, that's a huge story that I've always kept with me because one of the things that are important to overcome fear, and in this case, for me, it was the fear of failure. And I don't think it was actually the true consequences when I look. I think it was simply me being afraid of what other people would think because people think you're going to be so successful and you're going to do big things and all of that goes in your head and we don't want to disappoint them. Well, the reality is if all of those things are going to be true, what people believe and think about you is that you're going to be successful and you've got a great future ahead of you. And I was very blessed with a great family and a lot of opportunities. And I believe those things to be true. I was willing to work for them. But if all of those things are true, that doesn't mean the path to get there is going to be easy and you're going to fail. And so for me that evening, I accepted the fact that we may file bankruptcy. We may have to admit publicly. And as I said, there's no greater admission of failure publicly from a professional perspective than filing bankruptcy that we failed. And it wasn't really that bad. The real consequences, especially at that age, weren't that bad. Now, had I had a family and things be different, certainly there would have been, maybe the consequences would have been more meaningful. But at the same token, they can't take away anything meaningful, your family, your friends. There's even carve outs for your home in the bankruptcy rules. I felt once I just faced that and accepted it, a weight off my shoulders like you can't possibly imagine. And what was it all about? Nothing really meaningful, nothing tangible. It was all something within my mind, something that I believe that we all grow up with in our American society of fear of failure and angst over what other people think. Look at how much I worried about, I don't want to say nothing, but nothing. You tried something and you failed. If you hurt people, you take note of it and you work the rest of your life to make sure that you can treat them as you would like to be treated. And just like Famous Dave's did, I think that was a huge lesson for me. And I hope that story is a huge lesson for you. If you are afraid to fail, but more importantly, you're afraid of what other people think about your failure, you're going to be stuck in neutral for a very, very long time. But the positive thing is if you acknowledge it, if you face it, if you think about ways to mitigate it so it doesn't happen, but ultimately can accept that it may happen, what will happen is you will feel a weight lifted off your shoulder as well, and you will think much more clearly. And then you will be making decisions and taking actions not driven out of fear, recognizing that there's a possibility that that happens. You're going to do everything you can and work as hard as necessary to try to prevent it. But that if it does happen, you're not going to let your mind wander and over dramatize the actual consequences of that particular failure. And that was such a great learning lesson for me. And I hope for you, when you really think about this and you digest it, how many times or what in your life right now is how many things in your life that you want to change, that you are dissatisfied with. And let's keep it professional, but it could also apply personally. And again, we're operating within the bounds of morality and laws. That should go without saying, but in this day and age, sometimes that's not the case. How many things are you not doing? Actions are you not taking because you're driven by fear? A couple of weeks ago, probably 4 or 5 weeks ago, I was out advertising for one of the businesses I've talked about in the past, King's Woodshop. My brother and I have that business and we make very high-end furniture. And I had to do cold calling. I've done cold calling before. I did it when I was in Proviro. And let me tell you, cold calling for commercial trash services is one of the least fun things to do. You also do it in banking in the financial services industry, and it's a very long sales cycle. And I think all of us, when we hear cold calling, kind of jitters go up and down our back, except for people that are doing it and have learned to do it well. But I knew I needed to do it, and I'm decent at it, but I don't particularly enjoy it. And so I was letting that fear of what stopped me for many weeks. I eventually did it, and it was fantastic. I had some of the best conversations that I had. I had not an advertising, but a booklet that showcased our work, and it wasn't hard sells or any of that. I don't believe any of that works, and I think it's actually counterproductive to what you're trying to do. And all of that fear that I had worried about of just going out, talking to people, saying who I am, and letting them know that we're here, I struck up a number of great conversations, and I'm confident that just in that one time, and I need to do it more, something will come of it. And so I want you to think about what you're not doing in your career or what you're not doing in your uh, drive to be an entrepreneur, if that's your goal. But it can be professionally speaking, just if you're trying to work up the corporate ladder. What aren't you doing because of fear? Look that fear in the eye and actually acknowledge it. First, I guess identify it. Maybe you're not doing something, but you're not sure why. More than likely, it's probably fear preventing you from taking action. And more than likely, it's probably a fear of what other people think of you if you take this action, or what other people think if you take this action and you fail. We have to get that out of our minds because it is one of the biggest destructions to possible success and humans' individual to tap their true potential of anything. It is this idea of fear of what other people think of us. And anybody that says that that doesn't matter to them, that what other people think, they're lying. Okay, it's in who we are. It takes active work every day to put out all of the other feedback that you get, which you need to do sometimes, of people saying you're going to fail and this is going to happen and this is going to happen, and just focus on what you're trying to accomplish. And so you have this internal angst that prevents you from doing the things that you need to be doing. Now, I want to take a step back. I'm not saying that other people's feedback isn't important, and I'm also not saying that what other people think of you isn't important. There are many circumstances where that is important. And again, I'm operating within the bounds of morality and I'm operating within the bounds of the law. So let's say that again because it's important to iterate that. But I'm talking about things that are just perceived in our mind. I remember when I left Ernst& Young, and I told a number of people why I was leaving. My business partner, Jeff, and I had started the business. I was working 80 to 90 hours a week in the auditing world. And then I remember 4 particular weeks where I was on a client that was outside of Minneapolis. They were on the east part of the state, mid to east part of the state. I would work 80 to 90 hours Monday through Friday, sometimes Saturday, drive to the airport, fly back from where I was, go to Minneapolis, drive to Eau Claire, work all day, all weekend until Sunday evening came along, drive back to Minneapolis, fly back to Indianapolis, which is where I was operating. And after 4 weeks of that, I looked like a zombie. I was basically non existent. So it became very evident to me that I wasn't going to be able to be so distant from the business and the operations of the business and still increase the opportunity of success in that particular business with Jeff. So I needed to move back from Minneapolis to Eau Claire is what I'm trying to get at. And when I told people why I planned on leaving to continue to start this garbage company and really take it to the next level, I got so many people looking at me like, you're such a fool. You're going to fail. You have no idea what you're going to do. And thankfully for me, this was the good part of being a little bit arrogant and maybe more overconfident. What they said didn't matter and it didn't stop me from doing it. And I'm thankful that that was the case. And there are a lot of times when you're going to need to have that grit in spite of many other people's opinions that are less than helpful. Constructive criticism is a completely different thing, and we all need to hope and pray for constructive criticism. I focused a lot on fear. And the reason I focused a lot on fear is because if you truly sat down and took an account of all of the things in your life that you want to accomplish and why you aren't taking steps to accomplish those things, and again, I'm talking professionally, I bet almost all of the steps you're not taking are driven by fear. And if you think about that fear and you acknowledge it and you analyze it, what are the consequences? What are the real consequences if of whatever that fear is? Is it failure? Okay, what's going to happen if you fail? Go down that path. And I've given you a particular situation for me that was meaningful, but we all have different fears. All of us do. And I think that opportunity awaits with every different type of fear that is out there. And those who take advantage of the opportunities that lie behind fears that most people don't identify and most people don't acknowledge and most people don't face, those people who do accomplish their dreams. And I think we see a lot of successful entrepreneurs in this day and age who have done that. And the main difference between those who achieve what they're trying to accomplish and those who do not, and this is from my experience, and this is looking in, within the United States and all the opportunities to everybody. And I recognize some people grow up in different neighborhoods and we all have different, uh, some of us have more opportunity from the start than others, but in this country, there are hundreds of examples of people from all walks of life, background, socioeconomic status that have achieved success, indicating that it's possible for almost anyone, if not anyone and everyone that wants it. The difference between those who accomplish it and those who don't are the ones that face their fears and they look at them and stare them in the face and figure out how to overcome them. I want to talk about overcoming failure. Fear is the emotion. Failure is the actual thing that we're afraid of. I think that's the biggest fear of why people don't go out on their own and why they don't take a risk in business and why they don't try to start something. I talked about that house at the beginning of this episode. I want to give a little bit more color to that and tell you the impact that it had for me so early on. And it took a while to get past it. But as I indicated, I'm going to share a couple of different failures, and I don't want to dwell on each one too long. But the point in sharing these is these weren't minor failures, these were major business failures. And I'm still around and kicking. And if I can get past these, anybody can. The house in Minneapolis, that was essentially I was overzealous to do something fresh out of college. I was going to conquer the world and I wanted to get in real estate. And so I moved to a city that I wasn't very familiar with. It wasn't that far from Eau Claire, an hour and a half. But as any of us who have been in real estate, you want to get to know the market. We just had the great financial crisis. There was opportunities everywhere. This was 2009 going into 2010, but there was still a lot of uncertainty on whether the real estate market would come back. But prices were incredibly attractive. So for those who had hoarded cash, and looking back now, those who did that and they invested in real estate back in 2010, 2011, almost all of them are very thankful that they did. I wanted to be one of those individuals. I didn't have cash, I was just getting started, but I didn't want that to stop me. So I found a house, 2829 27th Avenue South. And in spite of my ignorance in real estate, never having done anything in it, I obviously had seen lots of shows and all sorts of people where I grew up were successful with real estate. And then I wanted to do that and I was going to do it in the big city. So I found this house that was pretty dilapidated. It had gone into foreclosure and I was going to remodel it. And I had a brand new garage in the backyard, which was fantastic. It was only about 2 years old. And so, without really, I shouldn't say I didn't do much due diligence, but I trusted a lot of people around me, a banker, a realtor, and the city at the time. And that was a mistake. I think that these people saw an eager, naive, young individual, and I was taken advantage of. Not that I'm blaming them whatsoever, because the entire responsibility rests on me. But I had an inspection of the house that was provided by the city because it was a foreclosure. There were requirements and laws within the city of Minneapolis. I think they still exist, but and it wasn't city owned, but that inspection had to be provided to anybody looking at the house because it was foreclosure and it wasn't livable. That was the key piece. It was not condemned, but basically condemned. You couldn't live there until certain modifications from the city were made. Well, I didn't become aware of those modifications that were required until after I closed. It was either kept from me, I didn't ask enough questions, and furthermore, I relied on an inspection from the city of the house, an inspection report, which was a big mistake. I did not get an outside independent inspection. For me, I'm like, well, if the city's provided this inspection, this is fantastic. I don't have to spend the additional $500. And again, I'm fresh out of college. I've got student loans. I'm living in an apartment that's $375 a month for a studio. It was probably about 150 square feet. I shared a bathroom with two other apartments. And basically, it was pretty much a drug house. Lots of people doing drugs throughout the house, but it's all I could afford, and it was all included all utilities for $375 a month. So I was not spending lavishly because I didn't have money to spend lavishly. Well, how did I get this house? Well, basically, the bank, what I found out later, was really that they were the ones that owned this. They were also going to provide the financing, and the realtor was somehow connected to the bank and got some commission if he unloaded this for the bank because they wanted it off their books, and they provided a rehab loan of 25,000. And because I had a job, W-2 income, I was able to show that on this, I think $100,000, I was able to afford the payment based on my W-2 income and my low rent. Well, come to find out, after closing on the property, it never had a foundation. It looked like it had a foundation on the back. The inspection report said it had a foundation, and there was no foundation. So when I started to do some work on it, that came to light, and essentially I had to tear the house down. And that was not expected whatsoever. The reason my intuition was good, I originally liked this property, is because it was zoned R4. And I had done enough work to realize that if this is zoned R4 and it's a single family, I can put a fourplex on this property in time. Obviously, I didn't have the financial means to do so at the present, but I got a little bit of rehab money and I could eventually fix it up, live in it for a number of years, and then turn it into a fourplex. Once I found out it was a foundation, had to tear the property down because you can't really put a foundation while the property's there. It just made more economical sense to tear it down. I was stuck with the house or with a lot with a new garage. Well, of course, the new garage had to get torn down because in the city of Minneapolis, you can't have a garage on a single family lot without a house, even though the circumstances were very different. And I won't get into how many times I had to visit the inspections department and planning review and development. And this is all new to me. And I'm trying to work 80 to 90 hours a week. And how many times I visited, it was just a disaster. It was a time I will never forget how many times I went there. And it just, and I paid for it. I paid for it for many years thereafter. I just kept paying on the loan and I basically had nothing. I ended up losing about $50,000 on that. And I think I sold it probably when I was 27, 28. So I paid it for 4 years, 4 or 5 years with nothing to show for it. Didn't have the financial means to really do anything with it. And of course, uh, did I say 24 when I bought it? It was before that. I must have been 22 because we hadn't started Provider Waste Services, the garbage company. But the point being is, I failed right out of the gates out of college. I had a big fat failure, $50,000, and that was a lot of money to me. But I survived. And would I do it again? No, because I've learned from it and I am much wiser now than I was then. But for me, it was a really good learning lesson. And that's the key thing about failure. And that's why you hear all of these quotes about failure being the foundation of success. And, one of my favorite quotes of all times relating to this topic is from Winston Churchill. Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. That defines my life, professionally speaking, to a T. Stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm, because eventually you will find success. And so for me, that was a huge financial blow right out of the gates, but I survived. And I want you to think about yourself if you were in that situation. Number one, I didn't take smart, calculated risks, so don't do that. But were you in that situation? How would you have reacted? Obviously, that's a tremendous amount of money at that age when you're just trying to get started. But I'm thankful that I took it. I'm not thankful I failed, but I learned so much from it. And if you're young, fail as many times as you can early. Not deliberately fail, but take risks because you have an opportunity to hit it out of the park. Once you have a family and you get older and you have far more responsibilities, it is more challenging. I'm not going to lie. Of course, it's more challenging. That doesn't mean it's not possible. And there are benefits to being older and more mature, a lot of them that can help you prevent some of the failures that happen when you're younger. But that's the key piece. Don't be afraid to take calculated risks. Failure number two, this was one in business, the garbage business, Provider Waste Services, and this was a big failure. Ultimately, we ended up losing $1 million, $1 million. And I have to tell you, it's not fun to share your failures with people, and it's not easy. But these are far enough in the past, and I've gotten through them, and I've learned from them, so it's easier to talk about them and because I face them. Now, sometimes if I'm, as we tend to do and do not do this, but if you live in that failure and you dwell on the past too much, it can really eat you alive. Don't let that happen to you. This one, particularly, I've thought of what if, what if, what if. That's not helpful. A lot of you guys listening out there have failures just like I do. If you are dwelling on them for the wrong reasons, you've got to stop doing that. It will only eat you alive. The point of a failure is to learn from it and don't repeat it. Don't sit and stew on what could have happened had that not happened, et cetera, et cetera. It did happen. Why did it happen? Learn from it, move on, and that is what will propel you to success. If you continue to live in the past and you continue to let that failure eat you and you continue to dwell on it, it's going to sap your motivation, it's going to sap your enthusiasm, it's going to sap your work ethic, all negative things and all inhibitors for you being successful. And the other thing is, if you dwell on a failure too long, it's going to dwell up that over dramatized fear or consequences from failure that I talked about earlier in the show. That's not something that you want to do. This particular failure, probably one of my biggest failures, especially in the garbage service industry, was To make a long story short, we were growing, thankfully, probably year 3 or 4 of the business, and we needed a place to dispose of our recycling. None of the competitors would allow us to give our recycling to them, and obviously recycling has to be separated from garbage because our volumes were too small, so they saw no money, and of course they were helping a competitor. So if there's nothing in it for them because volumes are too small and they can't make some money and it's for a competitor, why are they going to say yes? Well, we found a local recycling center that I've been going to since I was a kid, and what they typically did is they took aluminum cans from the public and other metals and they would pay you and then they would sell it in bulk to other people and make a margin there. Well, this particular individual was, who eventually became an employee of ours, was separating our recycling. We had come to an agreement to separate the recycling for us for our routes. Well, it was just becoming too much, and this individual didn't want to continue to do it. So Jeff and I looked at buying the business. We did all these calculations and all this analysis, and eventually we ended up buying the business. Way overpaid for the business, number one. Number two, uh, one of the reasons we overpaid is because it was heavily dependent on the metals market. And when we looked at the historical financials of the company and analyzed earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, commonly known as EBITDA, which is how you often value companies, multiples of EBITDA or a multiple of top line revenue, they were very advantageous. Metal prices had been high for the previous 3, 4, 5 years. Well, Jeff and I weren't that knowledgeable about metal markets. We're just trying to pick up people's trash and do it successfully every week and prevent trucks from breaking down and grow the company. So we ended up closing on it, buying it, and the metals markets tanked. I'm not saying that this was this failure is the fault of the metals market, but certainly we didn't do our due diligence in terms of what are the risks that are outside of our control and have we calculated for those risks in the purchase of this business. And part of the problem is we fell back into a corner because we didn't have an outlet for our recycling and we thought we had no other choices. Whenever you think you have no other choices, that's not true. It's false. And we, of course, eventually learned it was false, but it was too late at that time. We had already made the mistake. So we tried to grow the business, we tried to rebrand the business, we tried to market the business, and ultimately we ended up closing it down. None of it worked. A big part of it was the metals market, and the margins just weren't there. And the other part of it is we had too much operational responsibility in the waste services side, the garbage side, to focus on an outward facing business where you collect metal from people, pay them, and then sell it in bulk. Ended up closing it down after 3 or 4 years. And thankfully, the garbage business was growing enough where we were able to pay for the debt that we had taken on to purchase the business. And we didn't ultimately end up paying all of that debt back until we sold the garbage company in 2019. We kept on it from 2013 all the way to 2019. And it was a huge hindrance in our ability to grow and spend money on marketing for sure. But we had made an obligation to a financial institution. We had the means to pay it. And so we were going to bear the consequences. But we failed. And it cost us over $1 million. It's really hard to think about that because that's a lot of money. But I don't dwell on that amount of money anymore. I dwell on why did it happen? What can we learn from it? And how can we prevent it from happening? There's a lot more failures that I want to share with you, but I could go on for days on the failures that we've had. But I think you get the point. The point is you can have some catastrophic failures and still be okay, still make it. So what fear is holding you back from accomplishing what you want to do? Really, ask yourself that question. If you're listening to this in the car, what are you afraid to do? Are you afraid to cold call? Are you afraid to ask your boss for a raise? Are you afraid to go out on a limb and quit your job and try something that you've been wanting to do your entire life? There's multiple examples of people who, with $5,000 in their savings, have quit, and it was a huge risk and it paid off. Now, let's talk about overcoming fear and failure, because I'm not telling you just to quit your job today. We talked with guests in the past. We've had previous podcasts. How do you prepare for something like that? Taking calculated risks. So, number one, think about what do you want to accomplish? I want you to, right now when you're listening, I want you to list one thing, and maybe let's start with fear. What is the one thing you're afraid of that's holding you back from accomplishing the number one thing that you want to accomplish. And you can apply this personally, but I'm talking primarily from a professional perspective. Number two, or let's stick with number one. What is that fear? Identify it, acknowledge it. Number two, I want you to analyze that fear. Is that fear well founded? What are you really afraid of? And then I want you to think about, if you're honest about that, you're going to find, okay, either the fear isn't real or it's something that's perceived in your mind and the reality of it is not as bad as you see. Research. There's lots of people with fear, the similar fears. There's over 8 billion people on this planet. If you're afraid of something, there's probably 300 million other people that are afraid of that exact same thing. And there's going to be a difference between a few people in that 300 million and the rest of them. They're going to have faced it. They're going to have found a ways, or they're going to have developed strategies to address it, mitigate it, but still recognize it's there, and then try taking number two, or number three rather, our calculated risk. Take calculated risks. Identify, acknowledge, analyze. Number one, develop strategies to mitigate the fear after you, if it's still legitimate, if it's not this perceived fear of, oh, what is someone going to think of me because I fail? Who cares? Like, and I make it sound easy, like, to give that up. No, that's something we struggle with every single day. Anybody that says they're not afraid of what other people think, as I've said, or anybody that says they have no fears, they're lying to you. And we're all humans. That's the beauty of being a human. Some days I wake up and I feel like I can conquer the world, and other days I wake up and I'm like, oh, I don't want to face this or this or this, or I haven't done this and this because I was afraid to do XYZ. That's part of being human. You have to have days where you feel like that, but but you want to make sure that that's not every day and that those are few and far between. And all of it starts in the mind. All of it starts in the mind. One of my favorite Japanese proverbs about fear is only as deep as the mind allows. And that is so true. If you dig a big, beautiful hole for fear to fill up like water in a basin tub, it's going to do that exact thing. If you make it as shallow or have nothing there, it won't even have an opportunity to creep into your mindset. And that is so true. So, back to overcoming fear and failure. Number one, identify, acknowledge, analyze. Number two, develop strategies to mitigate it if it's a legitimate fear. Not that any fear isn't legitimate, but again, I'm talking about that has real perceived consequences. Let's say you're going to start a business and you're afraid to fail because if you do, you won't be able to feed your family. That's a legitimate fear. Obviously, you have other human beings that you're responsible for. Or let's say you start something, or let's say you're in a business and let's say you have 50 employees and this is a real big risk for your company. If you fail, all of these employees are going to lose their job. That's a real fear. That's something that hurts people. Develop strategies to mitigate that fear. And then three, take calculated risks. After you've done those things, you're going to be able to take calculated risks and determine whether moving forward with buying that other business that's going to triple the size of your existing business and could potentially threaten those employees' jobs, but it could also give you the opportunity to employ 3 times as many people. We always focus on the negative and the bad, and it's important to recognize that's there. But what you should be doing is find ways to mitigate that from happening, and it will. But if you find ways to mitigate that risk, that's why it's called a calculated risk, more often than not, or many times, especially if your mindset is in the right place, you will be successful. Number four, we talked about this, having a support system, people around you. It's so important. Every guest we've had has said, have a good support system. If you're endeavoring on something and you have internal fear, and of course, people around you are going to have fear, but they believe in you and they are there for your support system, you absolutely want to have that to help overcome fear and failure. And if you have someone who's not supportive and they're, whether it's a spouse or whether it's a family member or whether it's a colleague or someone that's trying to step on top of you in the professional world, address it. Either address that person or find a way to take that sphere of influence from that particular issue out. Obviously, if it's a spouse that hopefully, if you went into business, for example, you've had that conversation. It's challenging when, or maybe it's a business partnership with different humans. We all have good days, we all have bad days. Communication is so key there. But having a support system is really, really important. And then learning from your failures. I've talked about my failures, and if you don't learn from your failures, you're just going to keep repeating them, and then you kind of deserve to fail. If you don't fail, you're not going to be successful. And if you don't learn from your failures, you're not going to be successful. And the point of this podcast, as I've said many, many times, is for all of us to share our failures because hopefully in my failures, you can learn something. Now, it's different because I've experienced them, but hopefully you won't be as naive and foolish to rely on people that you don't know anything about, realtor or a bank, city inspection, when you can get a third party, independent third party to do and just verify, trust but verify. I didn't do that. Pretty easy step. Don't let that happen to you, but learn from your failures. That's key. And then I think the last thing, and this is a really important thing, and this is one that is hard for me or was hard for me to really grasp. I'm not a real emotional, touchy feely type of individual. And I believe in hard work ethic and, having not a tough outer core, but not complaining about everything and not whining and just doing your job, treating other people as you should be treated and moving forward. But sometimes you have to take a softer approach. And as I mature and I get older and I'm around my nieces and nephews, it's important to practice self care. And what I mean by that is you're going to fail. And this goes back to what I was talking a little bit before. If you continue to beat yourself up over that failure, not only are you going to continue to stay stuck in neutral, but you're going to put yourself in reverse. So, if you're going through a particularly hard time or you have a fear that's very, very overwhelming, figure out ways to help you get past that. Exercise, meditate, do yoga, talk to people that you trust about it, and be vulnerable. Be honest about it. I think one of the biggest things we have with our society today that is sad is we're afraid to be vulnerable because everything is so fake. And what I mean by that is you go on Facebook and everybody's happy. Oh, everybody's happy. What's wrong with me? Or you go on TikTok and you see all these amazing things happening to people, or everybody got a get rich quick scheme, but it's not happening to you. It's all fake. It's all a lie. Everything that you see in social media, not to be a pessimist, is pretty much fake. Okay, it's all a hoax. We're all humans, and if someone has a profile that's 100% happy, it's a lie. And they're probably some of the most insecure and most miserable people that there are. I remember a story that my brother shared with me. He and his wife were out at Cold Stone Creamery once. And I'll never forget this because it's a perfect iteration of what's wrong with our current society and what we can't let have happen to us in spite of how easy it is. They were what ostensibly was a boyfriend and a girlfriend were getting ice cream. And they had sat down and she had her phone and they were all happy and everything and a smile for the camera and all of it was being recorded. The second she turned off that button, it was like a switch change. They were grumpy, they were fighting, it's just miserable. That one little record button, because other people were seeing it, they wanted to create this fantasy that it's all roses and everything's beautiful and we're out for ice cream and oh, our life is wonderful. And then as soon as that's gone, because people aren't watching, real life happens. The point in saying this is, and this is especially hard for the youth of our generation, is don't let that idea of everybody else is perfect haunt your mind or hurt you. And this is all under practicing self care. Comparing yourself to others is not practicing self care, but being vulnerable, being real, and that's how we got on the topic of social media. So much of it is fake. So don't use that for anything. I pretty much use one thing, Twitter, and sometimes Instagram, and I should get better at it. But Twitter is a lot less prone, in my opinion, to that false sense of amazingness that everybody's lives are. Um, and that's what drives me nuts in this day and age. But be vulnerable, talk to the people, and address some of those fears. And what I've heard for me, exercising is a huge thing for me, and it helps me clear my mind. And I don't do enough of it, but I want to. But it also helps me. It's distinctly noticeable, or I see a noticeable distinction of how I process thoughts. This is for me personally, and how I think back on my failures, and I learn from them when I'm in a good mind, in decent health, and exercising versus when I'm not. You need to find out what works for you because it's different for everybody. Most people say that exercise is one of those things. I want to wrap this up because we've been talking a lot about this. And this is an interesting podcast for me because for so long, especially in my younger years, I thought all this was hooey. I thought it was all garbage, all this mind stuff and overcoming fear and oh, that's for sissies. What a bunch of hooey. And it was just me being my stupid young naive self and very very immature. And I think I struggle with these concepts for a couple things. Number 1, I've seen it abused in society. Well, you don't know what that person's going through and, mental health and those are important, but it's often way too often used as a crutch and just as an excuse for not trying to accomplish something. And so there's a balance there. But for me, talking about mindset and thinking about fear and thinking about whether it's self meditation or really being mindful of these concepts is really, really important. And I want you to think about it in what you're trying to accomplish. I want you to find fear. Figure out what your number one fear is and then find it. I want you to feel that fear. And this is very abstract. I recognize that. I have certain things for me where when I say this, I know exactly what I'm talking about. And hopefully the same is for you. And that's why I tried to share some of my fears. But face that fear, feel the fear. And what I think you're going to find is it's actually not as dire or something to be afraid of as you think. And then find failure. You do those three things. You find the fear, you feel the fear, you acknowledge it, and then you find failure. And I don't say you say, that's a bad deal, let me do that. That's a bad deal. You recognize what I'm saying. Don't be afraid to take calculated risks because fear and failure or fear of failure is driving you. Because that's a very debilitating and humbling, in a sad way, mentality to have. But rather, focus on what you want to accomplish, figure out what's holding you back from doing it. Ask other people. If you're not afraid, if you're trying to figure out why aren't you more successful at something or why can't this happen or why isn't it happening and it is fear but you can't put your finger on it, ask other people, read books. There's so many great examples out there of people who have succeeded wildly, whether out of personal catastrophe or out of just sheer motivation and grit. We talked about Michael Jordan. John Foley started Peloton because his sister in law was killed in a cycling accident. Talk about talk about personal tragedy. What did he do with that? He said, "I want to find a healthier, more convenient, and more importantly, more safer environment for people to be able to cycle." And so he founded Peloton, and it's now a household name. We probably all heard this story. If you haven't, it's one of my favorite to share. J.K. Rowling, she was rejected tons of times, and I don't remember the exact number, whether it was 7, 8, or 9 times for Harry Potter, which is arguably one of the greatest writing pieces of all times. I've read all 7 books, I've seen all the movies many times, and she was rejected multiple times until she found that one publisher that said yes. Now, I want you to think about that. Had she not had the persistence and the motivation and the belief in what she wrote to continue, had she let the fear of rejection drive her, we wouldn't have that series. And what I find so ironic is that the reason, imagine being a publisher that rejected J.K. Rowling. And imagine now having to face that. Now, this is one of those examples where, yep, you acknowledge it. I was one of those people that failed. I saw it and maybe they were afraid it wasn't going to be successful. Obviously, they were. Maybe it was a nobody and so they didn't give her the time of day. And now you're one of those publishers that have to live with rejecting one of the richest, if not the richest authors of all history. That would be a hard failure, but learn from it. If you didn't give her the time, give the next person the time. The point being is that I find it ironic that probably their failure of the inability for the book to be successful resulted in one of their biggest failures in life, and that will happen. That's all the time we have for today. I want you to really think about the concept of fear and failure. It's something I do on a daily basis, and I check myself at the door. always, because it's not like once you face your fear, it's gone. As you move through life and you mature and more people become involved, or you start a family, whatever life cycle in, different fears crop up and they prevent you from doing different things. And I think that's the beauty of always the dynamic situation of you conquer one fear and then a new one comes in. You accomplish one thing and then you're not able to accomplish the next thing because you have a different fear. And for me, as I get older, the fears seem to be, I don't want to say get a little bit stronger, but I'm not as naive as before, which can be good and it can be bad. And I tend to let fear creep up and take more hold as I get older. And maybe that's natural than when I was younger. And that's something I personally always have to fight against. And again, we're talking professionally speaking. Think about what works for you, what doesn't work for you. Don't let fear and the fear of failure or past failures prevent you from tapping the potential that you can accomplish moving forward. Thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday. As always, this podcast is only as good as all of us collectively make it. If you have failures you want to share that you think our listeners will benefit from, if you have questions about any of my history, some of my failures, I'm more than happy to go into more detail, but not necessary. Hopefully, how we detailed it this afternoon or this morning, rather, is enough for you to see you can have big failures and you can still succeed moving forward. Join us on our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. You can reach out to me with questions, share any of your stories. You can do the same thing with Twitter, Holland Podcast. We'll talk about fear and failure throughout this week after the podcast is released on Wednesday. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get weekly updates of our video version when they're posted every Wednesday. Everyone, have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk again next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, Holland Podcast. That's Holland Podcast, for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.